There's a moment in every great rivalry where one man says something he can never take back. Israel Adesanya was sitting at the top of the world, six-time UFC middleweight champion, global superstar, the most marketable fighter on the planet, not named Conor McGregor, and he looked into a camera and said that Alex Pereira was going to end up in some pub, talking trash about beating him one time. He said it with a smirk. He said it like it was already settled. And what he didn't realize in that moment was that he had just pulled the pin on a grenade and handed it to the one man on earth capable of throwing it back at him. Because that comment didn't discourage Alex Pereira. It didn't embarrass him. It found him in a bar in Brazil, dragged him out by the collar, and turned him into the most terrifying force the UFC has ever seen. And the craziest part? Izzy built him. Every single step of the way. But before we get to any of that, you need to understand where Poatan actually came from, because nothing about this story was supposed to happen. Alex Pereira grew up dirt poor in a favela in São Paulo. He dropped out of middle school before he ever had a real shot at anything, and his first jobs were as a bricklayer's assistant and a tire shop worker. The people around him paid him the only way they knew how, in alcohol. And over time, that became his world. He showed flashes of real promise as a young kickboxer. But according to his trainer Plinio Cruz, Pereira's drinking prevented him from training consistently. His body couldn't hold up. His mind wasn't clear. He was a raw, violent talent, slowly rotting in a dead-end life with no real reason to climb out of it. And here's the thing about alcoholism. It doesn't care how gifted you are. It doesn't negotiate. It just takes. What saved him wasn't a speech or a program or a moment of personal revelation. It was his coach cracking open a door to something much older. You've probably seen Pereira walking to the cage in indigenous attire and assumed it was just a style choice. It wasn't. His trainer introduced him to his indigenous roots, to the culture and identity of his ancestry. And something in that connection gave Pereira a reason to trade one set of spirits for another. He stopped drinking. He started training like a man who had something to prove, not to the world, but to himself. And it was around this time that he earned the name Poatan, an indigenous word that translates roughly to hands as hard as rocks. Stone hands. The people who saw him hit for the first time understood immediately why that name stuck. One trainer said watching him connect on opponents was like watching them simply turn off. Boom. Night, night. It wasn't just power. It was a completely unique style. Hands low, weird movement, incredibly technical, and absolutely loaded with danger at every angle. From 2012 onward, Pereira began decimating the kickboxing competition in a way that was difficult to fully comprehend unless you were watching in real time. He collected championships across multiple organizations and became something genuinely rare, a simultaneous two-division Glory Kickboxing champion. Glory middleweight and Glory light heavyweight at the same time. It had never been done before in the organization's history. He was putting people into orbit. He was beating everybody. And at some point during this run, his path crossed with a young Nigerian New Zealander by the name of Israel Adesanya, who was building his own kickboxing legacy in China. Their first fight was tightly contested. Pereira earned a decision victory that snapped Adesanya's 14-fight win streak. And Izzy disputed it immediately, arguing he'd won and the judges got it wrong. A lot of people agreed with him. So they ran it back the following year, and this time Izzy was winning convincingly. He had Pereira badly hurt in the second round, and it looked like the score was about to be evened up. Then the referee stepped in and gave Pereira a standing 8 count, which was enough time to recover, reset, and deliver a left hook knockout in round 3 that shut the lights off. Izzy dropped, and with that, Alex Pereira was now 2-0 over a man who would go on to become one of the most dominant UFC champions in history. But here's the thing. Too many questions surrounded both of those bouts. Fans argued Izzy won the first. Fans argued the stoppage in the second changed the outcome. And rather than accepting those losses as a definitive verdict, Adesanya carried them. He carried them all the way to the top of the UFC. All the way to 6 middleweight title defenses. And all the way to a press conference where he told the world that Alex Pereira was going to be sitting in a pub somewhere, talking about that one time he beat him. Meanwhile, the man he was talking about was in a bar in Brazil. Literally, Pereira heard those words, and something shifted. He'd already been thinking about MMA. He'd had a brief taste of it in 2015, when he was submitted via rear naked choke in his very first fight, predictably, because grappling was a completely foreign language to him at that point. But after that, he scored 3 knockouts in his next 3 fights, 2 of them in the first round, and it was clear that even with massive gaps in his game, the power and the striking IQ were so obscenely elite that they covered a lot of ground. A 3-1 MMA record doesn't usually get you a UFC contract, but a 33-7 kickboxing record, 21 knockouts, and 2 victories over the biggest active star in the organization, that's a different conversation. The UFC signed him, and the second his name appeared on the roster. The question of who the best striker in the promotion was had a terrifying new answer. His UFC debut at Madison Square Garden against Andreas Michailidis was everything the hype suggested and more. Michailidis came in with a smart plan: smother Pereira, outgrapple him, take away the weapons. He even got to his back. And what was surreal about this moment was that Israel Adesanya was actually watching ringside and started coaching. Pereira through the screen telling him to shoot a knee in the clinch. Pereira, unaware of his personal hype man in the crowd, threw the knee, used the clinch to neutralize the grappling threat, and then eventually found the range to deliver a finish that left everybody in the arena with their mouths open. Joe Rogan, a man who has seen everything, said he'd been telling people about this guy, and nobody believed him. Commentators compared his power to a heavyweight competing at middleweight. His fists, literally, were described as the size of watermelons. He was a mythical creature that people couldn't fully believe was real until they watched him hit somebody. Fight 2 against Bruno Silva was a real test. Silva is a legitimately violent fighter with elite striking, and he wasn't going to roll over. Pereira didn't finish him, but he fought a very composed, controlled performance against a dangerous opponent and demanded the respect he needed in this new sport. He was learning MMA in real time in the UFC against genuine killers, and he was winning. 2 fights in, he was already being positioned as a title contender. He was 34 years old, operating in a narrow window, and he knew it. He said as much. He came here to be champion, and he didn't plan on taking the scenic route. The Sean Strickland fight at UFC 276 was, functionally, a title eliminator, and the contrast that night told the whole story. Strickland walked into that fight treating Pereira like a joke. He was trash-talking, clowning, not taking the threat seriously despite being told repeatedly what was standing across from him. His coach even had to pull him aside at the press conference and remind him to focus on his own fight after. Strickland got into it with Adesanya on stage. Pereira, as always, was stone-faced, emotionless, unhurried. He absorbed some early shots, stayed patient, and then in the first round he found Strickland with clean power and dropped him with a head kick and finished the fight. Sean Strickland, a future UFC middleweight champion, was out cold before the crowd had fully processed what happened. On the same card, Adesanya defeated Jared Cannonier in a performance that fans largely found uninspiring. The message couldn't have been clearer. The collision course was confirmed. Everything that was ever unresolved between these two men was now coming to a head. And the build-up to UFC 281 was absolutely electric. Izzy leaned into the psychological angle. He knew the fights. He'd studied every detail he had for more years of MMA experience, and he understood that his grappling and cage control were going to be the difference. Pereira, for his part, looked completely unbothered. He was physically enormous for the weight, class allegedly walking around at over 220 pounds and cutting down to 185, and he stood next to Adesanya at the stare-down and made a man who was already big look somehow small. Reports claimed his hands were literally twice the size of normal human hands. He was something from a different taxonomy. But Izzy had a plan, and the plan was nearly perfect. For 4 rounds, Adesanya delivered one of the finest mixed martial arts performances you'll ever see from a champion defending his title. He controlled the grappling exchanges, took Pereira down, kept him against the cage, disrupted his rhythm, and nullified the thing that makes Poatan the most dangerous man in any room, the left hand. He was winning clearly, intelligently, and completely, but Adesanya didn't account for what was happening to his left leg. Pereira had been hammering his calf kicks from the opening minutes of the fight, and by round 5, Izzy's footwork was compromised. He couldn't move the way he needed to. The perineal nerve was damaged. And then Pereira's corner delivered a speech in the final minute of the fight that multiple people who heard it described as something straight out of a movie. You're losing. You need to knock him out. Move forward. Throw in bunches. Let your hands go. You are going to be a world champion in 5 minutes. Pereira walked out for round 5 and did exactly that. He hurt Adesanya, backed him up, and finished him against the cage. In his 5th MMA fight ever, in under 1 year from signing with the UFC, Alex Pereira was the undisputed UFC middleweight champion of the world. Fastest anyone had ever done it. It wasn't supposed to be possible. What followed the title win revealed a side of Pereira that fans hadn't been prepared for. Everyone expected the stone-faced destroyer. What they got was a dry, deadpan sense of humor that made him immediately lovable. He leaned fully into the memes about him being the world's biggest hater, trolling Izzy's love of Pikachu publicly before showing up to a media day wearing a Pikachu jacket. He wrestled Daniel Cormier with a golf club. He shared his chicken strips with a hungry Justin Gaethje. He went live on Instagram during his own stitches. He looked directly at the camera during broadcasts with the energy of a man who has absolutely no idea what a camera is. Fans who had been rooting for Adesanya to get his revenge found themselves unable to stay mad at the guy who took the belt. Pereira wasn't a villain. He was just completely, genuinely himself, and that turned out to be one of the most entertaining personalities the sport had ever produced. But the rematch was coming. And Izzy had been sitting in the dark with 4 losses against this man, 2 of them knockouts, burning for a different ending. Adesanya's preparation for UFC 287 was different from anything he'd done before. He described it as his 8-mile moment, everything on the line, one more shot. He studied every detail of how Pereira moved, how he loaded up, where the vulnerabilities were. He talked about laying a trap. He talked about waiting for the right moment the way Ali waited on Foreman. And what happened in that fight is genuinely one of the most dramatic single moments in MMA history. Pereira landed 35 calf kicks, absolutely destroyed Adesanya's leg early, and had him backed against the cage at the end of round 2 looking like a man in serious trouble. It appeared Poatan had him exactly where he wanted him. And then, in an instant, Izzy found the shot he'd been waiting for. A left hand that hit Pereira perfectly clean. Poatan went down. Izzy swarmed and finished it. The celebration was unhinged. The relief on his face was visceral. For fights, 3 losses, and Adesanya had finally gotten his definitive answer. He was 2-time middleweight champion, and he did it in the same position, the same round. The same finish that he'd lost his title in. The symbolism was almost too clean to be real. It was a devastating loss for Pereira. But rather than spiral, he pivoted. He moved up to light heavyweight, which too many felt like a lateral move for a man who most believed was walking, around close to 225 pounds on fight night anyway. His first appearance in the division was against Jiri Prochazka, in a fight that had layered personal meaning. Prochazka was the man who had dislocated his shoulders so catastrophically that doctors described it as the worst injury of its kind they'd ever seen. And he was also the man who had defeated Pereira's friend and trainer Glover Teixeira for the vacant title. In a rematch for that vacant title, Pereira went to work on Prochazka's legs from the opening seconds. Had him on wobbly legs in round 1, forced him to switch to a southpaw stance he had no business fighting from, and finished him in round 2 with a right-hand counter. New light heavyweight champion. 2 divisions. 2 years. The fastest anyone had ever claimed a UFC titles in the organization's history. It was in the aftermath of that second title win that Pereira said something that reframed the entire story. He stood in the cage with 2 belts and talked about Adesanya, not with malice, not with triumph, but with something that sounded almost like gratitude. He said that Izzy told him he'd be in a bar, and in a way that comment was what dragged him out of the bar. He said he wanted to rescue Adesanya from his inactivity the same way Adesanya's words had rescued him. The man who was supposed to be the villain of Izzy's story turned around and said the villain was the best thing that ever happened to him. And that is the full circle of it. Adesanya told 2 lies and 1 truth in that interview. The first lie was that Pereira only beat him once. He'd beaten him twice. The second lie was that nobody knew who Alex Pereira was. Everybody knows now, and they always will. The truth, the painful, cutting, brutally accurate truth, was the pub comment. It hit different because it was aimed at a real wound, a real past, a real version of Alex Pereira who was drinking his talent into the ground in a dead-end life with no exit. Izzy reached into that wound and squeezed. And the response was a man who became a 2-division UFC champion in 11 MMA fights. Headlined 2 of the 3 highest-grossing pay-per-views in Madison Square Garden history. And beat for UFC champions along the way. Izzy thought he was dismissing him. What he actually did was write the first chapter of one of the greatest origin stories the sport has ever seen. At the end of the day, everyone knows who he is now, and that's entirely Izzy's fault.